Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a true financial thriller centered around one of the most recognizable sports brands on the entire planet, FC Barcelona. Look, even if you don't watch a single minute of soccer, this is just a masterful business case study. It's the story of how a seemingly unstoppable empire nearly collapsed under its own weight, the desperate, wild measures it took to survive, and the incredibly steep road it faces to rebuild. If you've been following European football, you know the drama on the pitch is absolutely nothing compared to the drama in the boardroom. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this with a number that literally redefined modern football. 1.35 billion euros. Yeah, that was the staggering gross debt FC Barcelona hit during its peak financial crisis right around 2021 and 2022. I mean, just think about that for a second. We're talking about a football club operating with the kind of debt profile you'd expect from a mid-sized multinational corporation. It's a number that fundamentally threatened the very existence of a club that's owned by its members, meaning there are no external billionaire shareholders to just swoop in and bail them out.
So, that brings us to the core mystery of today's explainer. How does the world's richest club go broke? That's the billion-dollar paradox here. During the late 2010s, Barcelona was an absolute commercial juggernaut. Back in 2018, they actually generated a global record revenue of 885 million euros. They had the biggest superstars on earth, the most lucrative sponsorships, and an unshakable global brand. So how do you rake in historic, record-breaking amounts of cash and yet somehow slide right to the edge of total financial collapse?
Part 1. Record revenues, record debts.
To actually understand this collapse, we have to look back at the era under former President Josep Maria Bartomeu. During this time, the club was bringing in money hand over fist, but somehow they were spending it even faster. It created this incredibly fragile financial bubble. Now, La Liga recommends that clubs keep their players' salaries under 70% of their total revenue, but just look at this trajectory. In the 2019 to 2020 season, Barcelona's wage bill skyrocketed to a completely unsustainable 671 million euros. That was the highest salary mass of any sports team in the world, pushing them well past 80% of their revenue. By the pandemic hit 2020 to 2021 season, while with revenues dropping, wages were suddenly choking over 90% of what the club was bringing in.
And, those astronomical wages, they were paired with eye-watering transfer fees. The club was desperately trying to replace the irreplaceable, the departure of Neymar, by just throwing massive sums of money at players. We're talking roughly 135 million euros on Felipe Coutinho, another 140 million on Ousmane Dembélé, and 120 million on Antoine Griezmann. This bloated, super high-risk spending strategy basically built a giant house of cards. They were banking on endless, uninterrupted revenue growth to cover these massive, long-term costs.
Part 2. The crash and the audit. So when the pandemic hit, stadiums closed, the museum emptied out, and the music completely stopped. That bubble burst, and it burst spectacularly. The incoming administration under Jean Laporta took power in 2021 and immediately ordered a forensic independent audit by Deloitte to uncover exactly what they had just inherited. Now, I want to be very clear here. We're impartially reporting the strict findings of that independent investigation and the resulting reports to the prosecutor's office. The investigators reported finding, quote, payments without cause, payments with a false cause, or disproportionate payments. And the corporate lawyer presenting these findings described evidence of, quote, very serious criminal behavior. Again, these are strictly the conclusions of the official audit, pointing to severe mismanagement.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer disparity. The audit uncovered that a shell company was allegedly created solely to process intermediary commissions from the club. While your standard commissions in the football industry usually hover right around 5%, the investigators found commissions being paid out by Barcelona that reached up to 33%. 33%. It's almost absurd to even think about. It was an astounding drain on the club's resources.
Part 3. The cost of losing Messi. Because of that massive debt and their plummeting income, La Liga's strict salary caps, which essentially dictate that you can only spend what your revenues justify, kicked in incredibly hard. Barcelona simply couldn't register new contracts, and that forced the absolutely unthinkable, the departure of club legend Lionel Messi. And look, that wasn't just an emotional blow for the fans. It was an immediate financial disaster. According to Brand Finance, Messi's departure risked knocking a staggering 137 million euros right off Barcelona's brand valuation. We're talking about an 11% overnight drop in the club's global brand value, directly linked to a single player walking out the door.
When you actually break down that 11% value drop, the reality is pretty shocking.
They projected a loss of 77 million euros just in commercial revenue, mostly because corporate sponsors flocked to Messi's global following. Another 43 million euros was lost in shirt sales and merchandising. I mean, the number 10 jersey was a global phenomenon, right? And finally, 17 million euros lost in matchday revenue from fans who literally traveled across the world specifically to watch him play. Messi wasn't just a player, he was a primary economic engine for the entire organization.
Part 4. Economic Levers and Limits.
So, faced with a severely damaged brand, a mountain of debt, and La Liga strictly preventing them from registering new players, the Laporta administration had to make some desperate choices to resuscitate the club. They turned to what they famously called economic levers. Think of an economic lever kind of like this. Imagine you're deeply in debt and you can't pay your mortgage, so you sell off the rights to rent out your guest room for the next 25 years just to get a massive lump sum of cash right now. That's exactly what Barcelona did. They sold 25% of their future domestic TV rights and 49% of Barca studios to investment funds. It provided the immediate cash injection they desperately needed to register new signings and avoid total bankruptcy, but importantly, it sacrificed pieces of the club's future income just to survive the present.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how much ground they still have to make up. Because despite pulling all those levers, La Liga's rules remain incredibly strict. For the 2025 to 2026 season, Real Madrid gets to operate with a squad cost limit of over 761 million euros. Barcelona, just 351.3 million. It's almost hard to believe, but because of all that historical financial baggage, Barcelona is basically forced to compete against their biggest, bitterest rival with less than half the financial firepower. But, they are slowly starting to clean up that balance sheet. Just recently, they hit a really major milestone. They made a final 16 million euro payout to officially settle a massive 121.7 million euro deferred wage debt. If you remember back in the absolute peak of the 2020 crisis, players like Messi and even former manager Ronald Koeman agreed to defer a huge chunk of their salaries just to keep the club afloat. Paying this off finally closes out one of the darkest chapters of their recent history.
Part 5. The Road to Recovery.
To just survive right now, the club is implementing super strict cost controls, and they're leaning heavily on young, inexpensive academy talents like Lamine Yamal and Gavi, who cost a fraction of the mega superstars they used to buy. But they're taking a massive short-term hit by playing away from home at the temporary Olympic Stadium, which is costing them roughly 70 to 80 million euros a year in lost matchday revenue. Why? To build the Espai Barça project. This is a 1.5 billion euro total renovation of the legendary Camp Nou, and it's financed by a consortium of international banks, including Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. It is the ultimate gamble. The club truly believes that a modernized stadium generating over 200 million euros a year is the absolute only way they can structurally compete with oil-rich clubs and Premier League giants in the long run.
Now, the timeline for this recovery really puts things into perspective. They hit peak crisis in 2021. They finally paid off those deferred pandemic wages in 2025. They're hoping to clear their regular net debt by 2030. But that massive Espai Barça stadium loan, that won't be fully paid off until somewhere between 2048 and 2050. This is absolutely not a quick fix. We are looking at a multi-generational recovery effort.
And here's the real kicker. They're trying to execute this incredibly delicate recovery while the rest of Europe is just accelerating. The overall European top division income is expected to pass 30 billion euros. TV revenues, UEFA competition money, it is all growing. So Barcelona somehow has to stay competitive in this booming, hyper-expensive ecosystem while simultaneously untangling a billion-dollar web of historical debt. It's a massive tightrope walk.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to take away from all of this. Through economic levers and massive loans, FC Barcelona has quite literally sold off portions of its tomorrow to ensure it survives today. So the question that will likely define the next 2 decades of football history is this: can a club sacrifice pieces of its future and still remain the king of Europe? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating financial paradox with me. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.